Hello everybody, this is Benny Hills and I'm really excited to announce a new type of video that I'm going to make. So I'm going to make a series of theory videos, maybe twice a week, and for the first one we're going to be talking about the art of the cantrip. So I want to start off by talking about why this is important, and it goes back to one of the first live tournaments I ever played in. I was playing Blue Eye Control, of course. I wasn't nearly as confident back then. It was a small event. It was like 5 rounds and then cut to top 8, and I went 4-1, made it to top 8, and then was like just cruising through the top 8, made it to the finals, beat Burn twice, and that was like my really scary matchup at the time. And the finals was against a 4-color control deck. They were not playing red, but they had Lingering Soul, like Blue White Control with Lingering Souls and like, oh no, not playing green, and then like some Lightning Helixes and stuff in Modern. And I drew a bunch of Serum Visions early on. It was like, sweet, this card's great. I was just casting all my Serum Visions, like finding all these cards that I want, and was like maybe a little bit ahead in the early game, but it was a control mirror. It was, and this was before the era of Planeswalkers where you could just really snowball. And so I was a little bit ahead. My opponent was able to sort of fight back. And then in the middle of the game, I started really flooding. And I was like, are you kidding me? Why am I flooding so much? And eventually my opponent did win both games from this. And I got second in the tournament. And afterwards, I asked the guy, it seemed like he really knew how to play control. And I was like, so, like, why do you think I lost that game? And he was like, dude, you burned all your Serum Visions when any card was good. Like, there was no need to cast them all then. And then you flooded in the late game. And I saved my Serum Visions and then cast them then. And I kept on having action, and I was able to sort of overwhelm you then. And it really opened up my eyes because to that point, I was sort of, I mean, I was a little bit more nuanced than this, but I was generally operating under the assumption that, like, you have mana for a card, you play that card. I mean, the epitome of doing this poorly is like turn one, Mountain, shock your face. Like, you probably all know someone that's done that in their first game. But, like, and it doesn't take that long of playing to realize that that's not good, but other than removal spells, a lot of people really do use this heuristic. And it is right a lot of the times, but not always. And so I'm going to break down when you want to and when you don't want to play your cantrips early, and sort of the role that cantrips play in various decks, because it is very, very different from deck to deck. So there's three main purposes for cantrips, and they have use in different decks. So you can have cantrips in aggressive decks, cantrips in control decks, and cantrips in combo decks. Those are really the three main uses for them. So first, combo decks. In a combo deck, your whole deck is built around assembling a certain combination of cards and winning the game with those cards. So say you're playing like Sneak and Show in Legacy. Like, what you're looking for is a Sneak Attack and an Emrakul or a Grizzlebrand, or a Show and Tell in one of those cards, or Omniscience, or, there's a couple different combinations of two cards that you want to find. And you know from the minute you're making your first mulligan decision that, like, this is what you're trying to do. And so in those decks, you usually do want to play your cantrips immediately, because your goal is to win quickly before your opponents who have more, like, I don't know, controlling aspects or aggressive aspects. Like, you want to win before they can really enact their game plan and, like, either disrupt you or kill you. So pretty much on turn one, you know exactly what you want. Like, you see your hand, oh, I have a show and tell, so looking for the Grizzlebrand. And, like, you know exactly what you want, and you can just use your cantrips to always find those cards. So in those decks, you do usually want to choose your cantrips immediately. But that's not always the case. So I'm going to go into aggro decks next, but then most of this will be about control decks, because I think that is just the most interesting and the thing that I know the most about. So in aggressive decks, this hasn't been a thing historically, but nowadays with all the prowess creatures and that being one of the best aggressive red tactics, there's a lot of decks that use cantrips in red aggressive decks. And in those decks, I mean, part of the draw is to, like, smooth your deck, but it's also a prowess enabler and just an enabler for some spells. So, for example, if you have a 2-drop with prowess, or like a Stormwing Entity or something like that you're going to play on turn 2, you usually don't want to play your opt on turn 1. Like, in that situation, the way you get the most value is from pushing through extra damage with this. So when you have a creature that you'll be able to stick very soon, and the game isn't set to end in like the next turn or two, then you should usually wait until you can get as much damage as possible. And this is a bit of a difficult balance, because say you have like one creature in play, but you're going to play a second creature soon, then it's like you really need to read the room and sort of figure out if you think that your creatures will be able to live. If you think that your opponent is not really interacting with you and it's sort of just like goldfish as fast as you can, often you will want to wait so that you can get a second creature into play and turn your opt into a shock as well as a cantrip. But if you just are worried, like if you're playing against a control deck and you don't want to overextend, or you just don't know, it's not a given that you'll be able to continue getting hits with your creatures, often it is right to use your cantrips just to boost their power immediately. You also want to be aware of sometimes where it's an enabler for things like Stormwing Entity. You just don't want to just fire off an opt. You might have 3 men on a future turn, and you can use it to cast your Storming Entity then. So you'd want to make sure you save it there. But if you don't have a creature, the vast majority of the time you do want to just fire off your cantrip then, because you can't really afford to just sit around playing draw go. Like, you need to be applying pressure, and so your cantrips can help you apply pressure. And even though, yeah, your pressure will be a little bit less explosive if you don't have cantrips when you do draw your creatures, you just need to find your creatures. But by far the most important part of this discussion is control decks. Partially because control decks are just the best in general, but also because there is a lot more nuance here. So I think a good heuristic in control decks, at least in game 1, is to never ever play a cantrip on turn 1. And so if you know what you need as lands, that's one thing. But in general, there's a lot of value in waiting. And so to take the most extreme example, you're playing a modern control deck with Serum Visions. You play Island Serum Visions on turn 1, and you scry into Supreme Verdict and Force of Negation. You have 3 lands, like, maybe 1 Planeswalker, 1 counter. You have literally no idea what to do here. Like, you could be playing a deck where Force of Negation is your best card, or where it's a complete brick. And same thing for Supreme Verdict. So that's a situation where you really have no idea what you want, and the entire value that a cantrip gives, which is helping you find what you want, is wasted. Like, you might as well just be drawing a card at random, because, like, there's such a high chance that your scry will end up giving you a card that will be dead. Or, conversely, you'll, bottom a card and then be like, wow, like, now I'm getting killed by all these elves, and if I kept that Supreme Verdict, I would easily win. So, you really, the name of the game is you want to wait as long as possible, or until you know exactly what you want. So again, if you have no land, you need to play it then. But like, if you're hitting land drops, then like pretty much you always want to wait when possible. And a good way to illustrate this is like on turn 1, say you have 3 lands and like a couple spells. Like, a land is a good draw, and a spell is also a good draw. There's a pretty flat power level, whereas in the very late game, a land is basically a brick, and some spells can just instantly win the game. So there's a massive power differential, and so being able to like push 2 bad cards at the bottom is so much better than the very marginal upgrade you get from like, maybe drawing a slightly better card, but like you would have also liked the card that you're not drawing. So in general, because of this, you do want to wait, but there's a couple times when you do want to play them immediately. So one example is if you're constrained on blue mana. So say you have a Field of Ruin, a basic Plains, and like 1 blue source, and then you have a bunch of blue cards in your hand. You know that you're not like, you don't have just blue mana sitting around that you have guaranteed access to in the later game. So in these situations, it often is correct to use your cantrips early, even if you're not sure exactly what you want, because you just are constrained on blue mana and you don't want to get stuck with a bunch of cantrips in hand, but not having the time to cast them. The other example, as I've alluded to, is you need to find land drops. It's extremely important in control decks to hit land drops every turn for the first couple turns of the game. Your cards are generally pretty expensive, and like you'll be falling behind, and you need to be able to catch up. And if you have a bunch of lands and no spells, you can draw the right spells to catch up. But if you have a bunch of spells and no lands, there's no guarantee you can catch up even if you draw your lands. So if you have no lands in hand, you always want to cast a cantrip for them. Not always, but very usually. And like, especially if it's a card that the decision comes the next turn. Like, if you have a Ponder, you can wait until the turn where you're going to miss your land drop and then play your Ponder. But if you are playing Serum Visions, you want to play it the turn before you're going to miss your land drop, because that way, the next turn when you might not be able to play your land, that's when you'll be able to gain the benefit. The other thing is that some cantrips cost more than 1 mana, so those you often want to play immediately when you get the chance. Most cantrips cost 1, and they're just much better if they cost 1. That's just such a smaller investment. But there are, if you're playing Impulse, for example, then it often makes sense to cast it as soon as you can, just because it's not a guarantee you'll be able to have 2 mana up every turn for a while. Also, I will note, there's some cantrips that don't offer decisions, like Frantic Inventory, and those you pretty much always want to cast immediately. Like, there could be some corner case scenarios where you want to wait. For example, if Frantic Inventory is drawing you multiple cards and you don't want to discard a hand size. But, in general, you always want to use your cards that give you decisions later, and your cards that just do one thing earlier. So you can play your Frantic Inventory first, and then you'll have a better sense of what you want to impulse for later. This does change if, again, you know exactly what you want and you need it right now. Like, if you really need your 3rd land, you should definitely play Impulse over that Frantic Inventory. But, in general, you want to use the ones that have decisions later. The other time where you want to use your cantrips immediately is if you do know exactly what you want. And this is primarily post-sideboard, at least in Modern. So say you're playing against Dredge. I actually think one of the best hands you could possibly have against Dredge is 3 islands, 4 Serum Visions. Or maybe better, maybe some white lands too, assuming you're playing blue-white control. Because if you have Rest in Peace in your opener, the opponent's mulliganing the Thoughtseize a lot of the time. But if you have Cantrips, you can really like dig aggressively towards Rest in Peace starting on the first turn. You know what you want from the beginning of the game. At pretty much at all stages, you want Rest in Peace. There's like some corner cases where you want like a Verdict more, but like you're probably losing that game already, and so you're digging for Rest in Peace. And there, when you know exactly what you want, it makes sense to use your Cantrip early and often. But that's again very rare, especially in like a control mirror. It's absolutely not the case. Like there, you really just want to hold your Cantrip until you're gonna have a land. That's a little note about how to use Cantrips in control decks. There's a couple sort of play patterns that come up with all of these decks that I want to mention. So first of all, instants don't need to be cast at instant speed. So it's very, very common that you should use instant speed cantrips on your own turn. For example, like say you just like have 5 lands, you're playing blue-white control and Pioneer, and you draw an Opt. You often want to play it on your main phase because you could draw a Teferi or like a better land to play or something that like influences what you want to do on your main phase, because the fact that Opt is an instant, you could draw into something that's not an instant, and then it would alter the play that you want to make. And that could be true even if you already like have another play you want. You could find a better play, or it could just like influence future decisions. So like if you have 3 mana and an Absorb in hand, obviously you don't want to play Opt main phase. But like if you have extra mana and you already have like, you know, excess mana for whatever you want to be using to interact with on their turn, it definitely is the case very often that you want to play your cantrips on your turn. This is why in general I'm more pro Serum Visions than a lot of people. It does seem like at this point Opt has just won as the better cantrip in Modern. And that does make sense for a couple reasons. Like Modern blue decks right now have a ton of counter magic, and they have, you know, stuff like Archmage's Charm, so they really are valuing blue lands a lot, lots of cryptic commands. And they have a bunch of Snapcaster mages, and so Snapcaster Opt is much better than Snapcaster Serum. Like 1 blue mana on your turn is a much smaller price to pay than 3 blue mana on your turn, and so Snap Opt is just a much more powerful line. But I like Serum Visions quite a bit for this reason that I've been saying. Like often you do want to cast your cantrips on your main phase anyways, and the most important thing in a cantrip is now we're getting into the area of assessing the merits of different cantrips over one another, which is very important in deck construction. A really, really important factor is how many cards a cantrip lets you see. So that is why, if you look at pretty much any legacy deck, they always play Ponder over Preordain. Ponder lets you see 4 cards, and Preordain only lets you see 3. And that is a massive, massive difference. So if you look at all of these deck lists, they all have 4 Ponders and no Preordains. And similarly, Serum Vision sees 3 cards and Opt sees 2. This is a pretty intuitive point, but it is worth stressing. Like, the merit of a cantrip is that it lets you dig through your deck, and a Ponder that lets you look at potentially 4 cards literally digs twice as deep as an Opt. 2 Opts is the same as 1 Ponder in terms of like just pure number of cards you can see, and that's a massive, massive difference. That means Ponder is twice as good as Opt. Like, not literally, but it basically like, so you always want to play the card that lets you see more cards unless there's a very, very compelling reason not to. And again, sometimes instant speed can be that, but not always. And so I really do like Serum Visions, and I think it's underplayed in formats where Opt is legal, just because people are very like into the idea of instants. But if you're playing a more tap out control deck with like a bunch of creatures and like planeswalkers, then I think Serum Visions gains a lot of value. Now I'm going to get into a couple notes about the card Brainstorm, which is widely considered to be the best cantrip of all time. And the reason for that is that it not only lets you find good cards going forward, but it lets you reshape the current cards in your hand, which is a huge boon, because like if you're mana flooded and you draw a Preordain, that's good because you can like greatly increase the chances that you find action with like the top of your deck, but you can't do anything about the lands that are already in your hand. And that's why Brainstorm is so, so powerful. So one thing to note, this is pretty obvious, and anyone that knows Brainstorm well knows this, but it's worth focusing on still. The reason that Brainstorm is good is because you can shuffle your library. So if you just play Brainstorm and draw 3 cards, put 2 back, and then just draw them for your next 2 turns, that can be good. Like if it helps you hit a land drop, or like helps you find a spell to play next turn, that's fine. But the reason to play this card is with shuffle effects. So the most common one is a fetch land, Flooded Strand in particular, if you're me. But also, like, you can use Ponders or Field of Ruins or other sources to shuffle your library. And then you can draw 3 cards. You can basically, like, completely remake your hand. It's like a mulligan that doesn't put you down a card. Because now you can draw 3 cards and then shuffle away 2 of your excess lands. Or, like, your 2 removal spells against a non-creature deck, or whatever. It just like is so good to be able to reshape your entire hand for such a low cost. It's very rarely correct to play Brainstorm at the end of your opponent's turn. That's a classic misplay that a lot of people make because it's like, oh yeah, my blue mana instant, I'll just play it with my island at the end of your turn. But then you immediately draw one of the cards that you could have shuffled away. So you're losing benefit right there. And it also just lets you dig one card less deep. So like say you want a land drop. If you untap, draw a card, and then cast your Brainstorm, you're seeing one extra card deeper, which can really make a big difference if that card is the land you need. One of the worst feelings is Brainstorm locking yourself. So say you don't have your next land drop, you play Brain Freeze or Brainstorm, draw like 3 spells, and now it's like, well, not only am I missing my land drop this turn, I'm putting 2 spells on top of my deck, and now I can't hit my land drop in the next 2 turns either, which is just devastating. So you really want to try to avoid that and cast your Brainstorm as late as possible to really maximize your chances of hitting that land. With Brainstorm, even more than with other cantrips, you want to wait as long as possible. And this goes even in combo decks a lot of the times, because you play it to reshape your hand. You don't play it because there's like one specific card you need in general. So Brainstorm is at its best, A, when you have a lot of cards in your hand, because then you just have more options for cards to shuffle away. If you have if you just top deck a Brainstorm and then cast it, you get to keep 1 card. And that's way less good than having 5 options of cards to shuffle away. If you have 5 options of cards to shuffle away, and you're choosing 2 of them, that's a ton of options. And this is why Brainstorm is so good. It just gives you way more options than any other cantrip. And so you want to cast it at a time when you have maximum options, which means you have the option of shuffling them away. You have the option of waiting on that. You have the option of putting back any 2 of a variety of different cards. So that's really how you maximize Brainstorm. And so you want to wait until you have as much information and as many options as possible before you use this card. This is why Brainstorm is widely considered one of the most skill testing cards in the history of Magic. And that's why it's such a sweet card. I love that it does that, and I love that it gives you a lot of ways to make slightly different decisions that can add 1% to your win probability. And those things really do snowball over the course of a legacy game where you could have lots of cantrips like this. There's a couple other specific uses for Brainstorm that come up in the legacy metagame that I'll mention. So one of the most common ones is hiding cards from Thoughtseize or Hymn to Torok or anything like that. So you play turn 1, fetch land, go. They go turn 2, swamp Thoughtseize. And your plan was to just untap, then play your land, play Brainstorm, and then shuffle cards away. But if your opponent Thoughtseizes you, you can use the Brainstorm to protect your most important cards. So you cast your Brainstorm, draw a bunch of cards, put back whatever card you most want on top, so they can't Thoughtseize it, and then ideally hold a bunch of lands to limit their options, and then you draw the card that they were trying to hit with your Thoughtseize, and that can really mess them up. Another use is to set up cards that care about the top of your library. So this was a huge thing when Sensei's Divining Top and Counterbalance were legal together in Legacy. With Sensei's Top, you can still use it with Brainstorm and Counterbalance though. So your opponent casts a 1-drop, you put your Counterbalance trigger on the stack, cast Brainstorm, and say they played a 2-drop, you can put any 2-drop from your hand on top, boom, Snapcaster Mage, counter your thing. And you can also use this with miracle cards, Terminus or Entreat the Angels, or maybe even Temporal Mastery. If it's stuck in your hand and it's going to be very expensive, but you draw a Brainstorm, you can put it on top and have it at the perfect time. And another thing to note, if you have 2 Brainstorms, you can even do this at instant speed. So you go Brainstorm, put on your turn, put Terminus on top, pass the turn, and then they animate their manland and play their hasty creature, and in their begin combat you play your second Brainstorm, and that Terminus is your top card. You draw it, and even though Terminus is a sorcery, because of the miracle ability, you can cast it at instant speed because it was the first card you drew this turn, and you can really blow them out with a 1-mana instant speed board sweeper. The other more common use, just less common for me, is with Delver of Secrets. It's very common for you to go turn 1, Volcanic Island Delver. Turn 2, untap, Brainstorm in your own upkeep in response to your Delver trigger. Put an instant or sorcery on top, flip your Delver, and then draw it and attack for 3. Because when you have a Delver, flipping it on turn 2 is a huge swing. That's much better than needing to rely on getting lucky. And it's usually under 50% that you'll hit without mini manipulation, that you'll hit it blindly. That's also a thing with Brainstorm is the best use for this because you can do it on turn 2, in response to the trigger. But it's also good with Ponder, because you can say you see land, Delver, instant, and you want the Delver but you don't want the land. You can put land on top, then instant, then Delver, draw the Delver, and then next turn, like, play the Delver, and then next turn you know that you'll be flipping it. So you, even if like you want the instant more, you leave it on top so that you can flip your card. So a couple notes about just cantrips in general, regardless of format or regardless of which cantrip it is. You don't want to go overboard on cantrips in general. If you just spend your turn, ponder, you see like preordained ponder, next turn preordained ponder, like you haven't really done anything. Like you've seen a lot of cards, but if you're just cantripping into more cantrips, that can fall behind. Like 1 mana is not too much to play, but if you cast like 5 cantrips in a game, that's 5 mana. And like, yeah, it's not like tapping out on your main phase for a 5-drop, but it's still, it really does tax the mana that you're using to interact. So this is fine if you have free spells like Force of Will, but if your opponent just goes like turn 1 Aether Vial, turn 2 Stoneforge Mystic, and you're just casting all these cantrips, like you can fall behind. So you don't want to fill your deck with like a million cantrips and have too much air and not cards that are actually interacting or adding to the board or like sort of advancing your game plan in more meaningful ways. This is less true if you're relying on like a combo that is pretty mana efficient, but if you're sort of trying to interact with your opponent, you don't want to go overboard on cantrips and like not be making meaningful plays. At the same time, though, when you do play a lot of cantrips, you can like assume that you'll see your other cards more often. So one of the places where this comes into play is sideboard cards. If you have 3 copies of a card in your sideboard, and you have a bunch of cantrips, you're very likely to be able to find those cantrips quickly, or those sideboard cards more quickly. So it can feel like you have 4 copies of a sideboard card, even if you have 3. This is a big thing in Legacy where Frantic Inventory is, or, the other one that I forget what it's called, there's a Accumulated Knowledge. It's better in Legacy than in other formats because you have so many cantrips that you can pretty reliably find multiple copies, even though, like, you wouldn't draw them naturally. Another benefit of playing a bunch of cantrips is that it allows you to run a bit fewer lands. So the exact math on this depends slightly on the cantrips. Like, obviously, Opt is way worse than Serum Visions for this. You can cut more lands if you're playing a bunch of Serum Vision effects than if you're playing a bunch of Opt effects, just because, like, you see more cards in the Serum Visions. But a general rule of thumb is, like, depending on the cantrips, for every 2 or 3 cantrips you add, you can cut 1 land. So if I'm, like, this is why a lot of Legacy decks, even if they have a relatively high curve, will only play, like, 21 lands. Because if you have, 10 cantrips, like, that makes it feel like you're running more lands than you actually are. Although, of course, you need the lands to actually cast the cantrips. Depending on the format, you also need to be aware of cantrip hate cards. So this is stuff like Chalice of the Void for 1, or Narset Part of the Veils, which shuts down all sorcery speed cantrips and like weakens instant speed cantrips. And also stuff like Trinisphere. Like, these cards can just make cantrips much, much worse or stop them outright. And so if you have reason to believe that your opponent is going to be playing these cards, often you want to just cast your cantrips immediately just so you can at least draw towards cards that you can still cast through these hate pieces. So in the dark, the only format where this is really something you need to consider is Legacy. And even then, like, you don't necessarily, like, it's still a fairly low percent of decks that are playing these cards. But in a format like Pioneer, it's very unlikely that this will come up. So if you have, like, a bunch of sorcery speed cantrips and you know your opponent's playing a bunch of Narsets, then you need to be aware of this. But in general, you do want to wait. Another, like, sort of next level cantrip use that a lot of people don't think about in my experience, but can really win games, is you can use cantrips to protect cards in an interesting way. So the most common example that's come up for me is if my opponent has a Field of Ruin and I have a Colonnade. And I really think this Celestial Colonnade could be a big part of my game plan, but it'll just die if I play it. So in that situation, sometimes it's correct to play Serum Visions and put 2 cards on top, even if you don't want them. Because a heads-up opponent will see, okay, they scry 2 cards at the top, they really want both of these cards. I'm going to use Field of Ruin on their Hallowed Fountain, even though, like, I would rather save this for a Celestial Colonnade, but, like, I think it's worth it just, like, really mess up their card selection. So they Field of Ruin you shuffle your cards away that you didn't want anyways, and then next turn you can play Colonnade, and they won't have an answer to it anymore. And then that Colonnade can, pressure their Planeswalkers, kill their life total. Like, that's a really, really sweet play that a lot of people don't think about that can totally win the game, because an unanswered Colonnade does win the game very quickly, and a lot of decks don't have a ton of answers, especially like Post-board and the Control Mirror. You're cutting down on paths most likely, and you're really relying on Field of Ruin to deal with Colonnades. So that can be a really big game if you can, like, sort of mind trick them into wasting their answer, and then you just slam your colonnades and win the game from there. Another consideration is if there's two cards that you want off of a ponder, how to stack them. So, like, say you see, yeah, two cards you want, you're going to shuffle away the third one. So, one card you draw immediately, and one card stays on top. Sometimes it's obvious, like, if you want to find Force of Will, and there's a Force of Will on top, like, you want that in your hand, so you draw it. But, say it's like a card you want, like, two cards you want to have access to next turn, but you're not playing either this turn. Then you need to consider the modes of interaction that your opponent can have. So, if they are likely to have a lot of hand disruption, you should put the card you want more on top, or in the middle, second, and then draw the card you want but you're less passionate about. But if they have a lot more shuffle effects, then you should put the card you want most in your hand, and like make sure that if they're going to Field of Ruin you or Surgical Extraction you or something like that, then you'll shuffle away the one that like you wanted, but it's fine. Another way this comes up is like, say you have one fetch land in play, and you might want to play Spell Pierce. Then you want the card you really want, you should put in your hand, because like ideally you don't need to crack your fetch land, and you can draw the second card that you want. But in the event that you do need to have access to Spell Pierce next turn, then you already have the card you want, and like it's a bummer to shuffle away the card that you also sort of wanted, but it's less of a disaster than if you lose the one that's like, I need this card. Finally, if you have a bunch of card selection already, most commonly through the form of something like a Jace the Mind Sculptor, or like maybe a Sylvan Library, cards that let you basically cast Brainstorm every single turn, then cantrips become a lot less necessary. At that point, it's more about like you have the right cards. It's about like having the mana to use them effectively. And so if you have one of those things going, often you just want to use your cantrips immediately to just like dig one card deeper and like find cards that are action. Like you don't want to be like invest a bunch of resources up front in a card that lets you have a lot of selection, and then also be using your mana every turn for more selection. That just gets a little bit redundant, and at a certain point there's, diminishing marginal returns to all your card selection. There's some cantrips that sort of reward you for waiting under certain circumstances. So one that comes to mind here is Visions of Beyond. So this is not a commonly played card, but if you're playing like a mill deck, you could be playing it. And it is a very difficult question when you want to just play Visions of Beyond to like draw your mill cards and sort of like race, versus waiting until you can draw three cards, which is obviously way better if you can get there. So in this situation, I think the most common heuristic I would use is if you have mana and all the spells in your hand will get you to the point where Visions of Beyond is turned on, then I like to wait, because like you have a very concrete plan to get to that point. You have uses for your mana. You're advancing your game plan. But if you just have like a bunch of lands in hand and you're not doing anything, it's pretty dicey to be hoping to top deck cards that will enable you and then draw your three cards. Like, meanwhile, your opponent is advancing their game plan or stockpiling counter magic, and like the time cost of waiting a couple turns to draw your extra two cards can be greater than like the card advantage benefit that you will get by waiting. If it's like one card, if they have 15 cards in their graveyard and you're like very close, you just need one top deck to turn it on, then maybe it's correct to wait. Although still, it's like it's close, because A, like you could draw into more Visions of Beyond, and B, you like in general just wait it. Like when you have a deck that's trying to like kill your opponent, not like outgrind them in the long game, then it's like a little bit dicey to give your opponents more time to develop their mana. So those are a lot of my theories about cantrips. Just to summarize or go through the macro points, there's three main uses for cantrips, and you should identify the reason you're playing cantrips in your deck. Are you doing it to find a specific card because your whole game plan is around that card? Are you using it to push through damage? Or are you using it to smooth your draws and find the correct answers? And depending on which your answer is to that question, the correct time to play your cantrip changes a lot. In general, you want cantrips that dig deeper. That makes them much, much more powerful, and you should really give a lot of merit to Serum Visions over Opt, even though most people talk about Opt being better these days. You want to cast your cantrips when you know exactly what you want. Don't just cast it because you have the mana. In general, there's some times where you do need to worry about that, but in general, only cast it when you know exactly what you want. And finally, know how the cantrips you're playing impact your deck construction. Whether that's, playing cards that synergize with the top of your library, whether that's trimming lands, whether that's making sure you have enough blue cards for your force effects. Just be aware that the way the cantrips that you're playing do influence your deck construction. So, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something. As you can see here, there were a lot of comments about asking for this sort of video, and so I was really happy to see that. I think these are fun to make, and definitely let me know in the comments if there's other sort of specific cards or specific like general theory points that you would like me to talk about. I think that these sort of things are really interesting to think about and really important, and can like have a tangible impact on your win percentage if you're just sort of aware of these like small things that are relevant and can sway the outcome of a game. So again, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for suggesting this on my last video, and please keep the suggestions coming. Thanks for watching. See you next time.